Gerald Ford assumed the presidency when Richard Nixon resigned in August of 1974. And Gerald Ford was kind of thrust into the situation immediately. He hadn't been vice president for that long. Spiro Agnew, as we've mentioned in prior videos, had resigned amid various different allegations of improprieties. And so he became vice president, Gerald Ford did. And then not that long later, he's now president of the United States. And he did so under conditions that were not very likely to see any sort of success. OPEC had increased its oil prices by about 400% in 1974 alone. So this whole oil embargo and oil price situation was causing a drastic rise, not just in the price of oil and the gas that you put in your cars, but anything that's made by oil or perhaps transported by gasoline or anything else along the lines, which is just refined oil. So you have increasing inflation, up and up and up. People are paying higher prices for average goods and things along those lines in the mid-70s. And in the meantime, you also see rising unemployment. Hold that thought. Otherwise, though, when Gerald Ford assumes the presidency, he's generally thought to be a really good guy. He's thought, okay, maybe he can try and help us get us past some of the animosity we've seen in our country for the better part of over a decade. Okay? A month into his presidency, Gerald Ford does something that will permanently be deemed as controversial at best. He announced that he was going to pardon Richard Nixon for any sort of impropriety in relation to Watergate. Okay? Clean slate. No criminal investigations, no penalties or anything else of the sort. Richard Nixon was going to be relieved of any sort of impropriety permanently. Okay. It was done as a move by Gerald Ford so as to maybe help the American public perhaps get beyond the failures in Vietnam, the struggles with OPEC and oil prices and rising inflation and unemployment. Maybe to kind of help America kind of get past the whole Watergate fiasco. But it backfired because Congress, which was controlled by Democrats, vehemently opposed that. And the American public, which wanted Ford to get off to a right footing, they still wanted to believe that Richard Nixon in general should face some sort of punishment. So by pardoning Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford's popularity took an immediate nosedive. And the public wanted to believe in Gerald Ford, and he immediately lost their trust. So for most historians and most people who were around at the time, including voters, it became very controversial for him to have pardoned Richard Nixon with a clean slate. And to this day, people still talk about, was that the right thing? Could Gerald Ford have maybe salvaged his presidency? Because we'll talk about what happens to him later. Maybe if he had taken a harder stance with Richard Nixon. Who knows? Okay. Otherwise, though, Gerald Ford's presidency wasn't just marked because of his pardon of Richard Nixon. As I just mentioned, prices were increasing because of OPEC's oil embargo. You still had that. You had rising unemployment, and people's incomes were generally maybe a little bit lower, or in the very least, they're not increasing. The combination of those things, lower to flat incomes, higher prices, and rising unemployment, those three factors are known as stagflation. And stagflation is one of the few times in America's history to where you've had all three of those things at once. Rising unemployment, flat to lowered incomes, and drastically increasing inflation. That's a nightmare for economic perspective. So 1974 to 75 or so were very difficult times in America's economic history. Imagine that. America having downward economic times. Geez, that didn't happen in the 30s. It Certainly didn't happen in 2008, and it's certainly not happening now, right? Didn't happen in 1893 or 1873 or 1819. We certainly don't have a history of economic downturn, do we? We're going to overcome this. Okay? Know that. Otherwise, though, one of the things that Gerald Ford did want to do is he wanted to be an amiable and genteel figure to bring the country back together at least. People may not have liked that he pardoned Richard Nixon, but they liked Gerald Ford in general. He's a likable man. I have actually met Gerald Ford before, rest his soul. He and his wife Betty, I had a chance to meet them when I was in college. Really great. Otherwise, though, Gerald Ford had a really likable demeanor. He just stepped on his own feet when he pardoned Nixon. And he had the unenviable task of trying to overcome those downward economic stagflation type situations. Okay. One of the things he did, though, was he retained Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State, who had become Richard Nixon's Secretary of State a few years prior. And going on at the time, as you had tensions in the Middle East, Henry Kissinger focused on the idea of bringing Israel and Egypt to the table so as to end some of their animosities. Of course, Egypt was one of the countries that had directly attacked Israel in 1973, and Israel retaliated and eventually took over total control of the Sinai Peninsula. Well, Gerald Ford, with combinations with Henry Kissinger, were able to renegotiate a peace accord between Israel and Egypt to where any future differences between the two countries would not be solved with violence. They would go more towards diplomatic in exchange for a return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. To this day, whereas Egypt and Israel may not exactly have the best relationship, it's been nonviolent, if anything else. Okay? Other folks in the region have a lot of animosity towards Israel. Egypt, they can rise above that. And it was because of that peace accord that Henry Kissinger helped to broker back in the mid-70s. Okay? So that's one of the things. Henry Kissinger has a controversial status among some people. Generally speaking, most historians view him reasonably favorably. Okay? Some people think he's the best thing since sliced bread. It kind of depends on who you talk to. Otherwise, though, that was one of the few bright spots within Gerald Ford's presidency. Now, Ford was thrust into the White House in 1974 as a result of Richard Nixon resigning. He would be eligible to run for re-election because he wasn't elected. He would actually be able to run for election since he was not elected to the White House. He would run for election in 1976. And he did so with a lowered popularity, obviously stemming from his pardoning of Richard Nixon. And he was seen as a really nice guy, but not effective. And he also had opposition within the Republican Party itself. You see, the Republicans, you have somewhat more of your kind of moderates, and then you have your more conservative, your true economic freedom type values type people. Former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, was one of those Republicans, a little bit more on the conservative side in the Republican Party. And Gerald Ford had to fight off a fierce effort from Ronald Reagan to get the Republican nomination for the 1976 election. That ought to tell you what might happen coming up when the actual election happens. Okay? Because the Democrats, they nominated Governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, who a former peanut farmer, a Navy guy too. Jimmy Carter portrayed himself as somebody who was a Washington, D.C. outsider. You ever heard that? Okay? As somebody who rejects the idea of your traditional federal mindset The idea that you don't want to adhere to various different norms within the party and within politics in general. The general unhappiness with Washington in general. Carter wanted to do something about it because he didn't come from the establishment. That sounds kind of familiar if you think about it. Okay. Um, so the unknown Jimmy Carter will face off against Gerald Ford in the 1976 presidential election. And the disenchantment with Ford enabled this new guy, Jimmy Carter, to eke out a narrow victory in that election 76. So in 1976, Jimmy Carter wins the election, and he would soon be inaugurated as the next president of the United States.